Hi, my name is Bharat Kumar Varma Sagi. I'm a senior data scientist at Starbucks, and today at the RTA Summit, we're going to discuss about real-time RAG with Apache Pinot for people analytics. So this discussion is pretty much around about the applications of real-time RAG systems while using Apache Pinot, and we're going to discuss a little more based on the agenda. So we'll start with addressing questions like why real-time people analytics matters, and what does RAG or agentic AI layer help solve, and what role does Apache Pinot has in such a system. And we'll follow up with a use case within people analytics using a real-time RAG, and also deep dive around steps to follow, like in order to build such a system, and how does Apache Pinot play a role. And once that is done, we'll discuss about some of the challenges, best practices, and thought process from a data science perspective towards the RAG agentic AI, and how does the real-timeness of the system helps. So going ahead, so what is people analytics? So organizations, as they grow, small, medium, or large-sized companies, they often have a lot of number of people working for them. For example, take Starbucks, or take McDonald's, or take Walmart. So you'll have a lot of stores. You have a lot of people working in various shifts in various regions, various stores, um, all across the country, all across the world. So you have a lot of people that are working with you, and there's a lot of information that you would want to extract. For example, how does the workforce composition and demographics look like, and what does the recruitment and talent acquisition patterns are, and how is the attrition, how is the retention of the existing employees, performance, productivity, learning and development, compensation, mobility, engagement, and sentiment of the workforce. So all of these questions are of most concern for leaders and people, managers, and executive leadership, etc. And they want to understand these details, and which in turn helps basically to make better decisions, right? So we understand a lot of these things by using people analytics, and whatever I just mentioned is pretty much common questions that are generally answered with the existing analytics system. Most organizations already have them in place. But where it gets complicated is when you'd want to understand a little bit more, right? For example, if you want to look at problems around predictive analytics, what might be the staffing requirement at a particular store on a given day, right? That is a predictive information that you need. Some other cases can be causal inference and impact analysis, and in some cases you have unstructured feedback in terms of surveys, or email conversations, or any responses to any questions in an interview or so. So you have an NLP use case over there. And you have diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, and you have human capital and business outcomes use cases, and you have scenario planning and simulation, organizational network analysis, etc. So you see the point, right? So the complexity increases when you try to answer complex questions, and the regular descriptive analytics or generic analytic systems might not answer all of these. So you might need some AI intervention, and this is where this discussion will follow. And another question is like, why do we need it real time, right? So some of these questions can be answered like based off of last year's data or last month's data. But why do we need it to be real time? Most important factors is leaders want decisions to be made immediate at the speed of business. Some of the requirements are to proactively risk mitigate. Sometimes you will have dynamic operational efficiency needs, and you would also want to understand in the employee exposure, given time. So you don't want to stay in the last year's data realm. So now, today, what are your employees talking about? So all of those information has to be fed to the system in a way that you have informed decisions to be made real time, and also compliance and safety monitoring, etc. So, okay, this is all good, but why do we need Apache Pinot, right? So let's first talk about what a traditional real analytics system is. So in general, any real-time analytics system, so what you have is a um, plain old on a high level, this is how the architecture that looks like. So you have raw data from coming from multiple sources, and you have an ETL process in place, and then you have analytical tables at the end, which is usually aggregations that are needed for dashboards, or if you want to run some analysis on the aggregated data, you will use these analytics tables. So likewise, for people analytics, you would have something similar, but the challenges come into place when you want things to be real time, when you want when you want answers faster, and you want to be informed with the right data set, right insights, rather than older insights that are not relevant today, for example. And some of the challenges are like high latency. So not all systems are built to solve the latency problems. So users want sub-second or lightning fast results, and also want to explore, do data explorations faster. And it's not just that you ask one question, right? So you generally have multiple thousands of questions, and you would want the system to answer multiple dashboards, multiple queries, multiple users, and you also have different types of data sets. So sometimes you have, if you are looking for employee engagement insights, you usually want streaming data fed to the system, and understand the data and figure out the insights real time, right? So, and also large scale. So when you're dealing with petabytes or even more size of data sets, that's where you need more reliable applications. And this is exactly where um, we could think of, like, now that you have all these data sets, all these infrastructure, you would want to understand, how do I leverage the technologies like AI, retrieval-augmented generation methods, and agentic AI, et cetera, all of these complex technologies. How do you want to uh, implement them? So, in general, this is how uh, a traditional rack system would look like. For example, if you want to build a system where you would want to understand certain details, right? So if in a general analytics dashboard, you just create a query and then run the query to extract the data, right? So, but then sometimes you would want to give it some context, right? So what happens is, when you ask a query to a rack system, the query is sent to a retriever. Usually, it is a system that is fetching certain documents relevant to the question or relevant to the application itself, and understands the context based off of the documents, and filters, or tailors the response accordingly, right? So on the back end, the documents are being transformed, so you don't just read the documents as documents, as in tables or PDFs or whatever. You would transform the data into embeddings, so that when you are using systems like RAG, so you want to pass the system to a large language model. So language models basically understand embeddings, as in vectors, zeros and ones. So you transform the data, you do a chunking on top of the data sets that you have, and then you use an embedding model. If you have streaming data, you will pass it to Kafka, and then generate those embeddings and save it onto a vector database. And that vector database is being used to extract the context when you ask the query in a RAG system. So now that the LLM has a context, and the query that you are looking for, so the LLM has much more reason, much more information than just using the LLM itself natively. So you could get better responses. But all that said, so you have a problem of this streaming, right? So uh, when you make changes, when you make systems that would want to respond to streaming data set, and especially rack systems, you would want to use a system wherein the responses, the information is retrieved at a much faster uh, timeline, right? So you want the results in within seconds. So this is where Apache Pinot comes in. Um, for example, so instead of saving them in any vector database, you save it in an Apache Pinot vector DB. This helps you address the problems of making it real time, making the retrieval possible at a certain scale, and since it has a massive, it is designed to handle massive amounts of data while maintaining low latency. It's a perfect use case or perfect scenario where you could use an Apache Pinot. And in turn, in our topic discussion within people analytics, you can extract responses because every second counts. So yeah, so once you replace the vector database as a Pinot cluster or a Pinot vector database, so you let's say you take an example of employee interaction data, you would want to ingest the data into the Pinot database, and then the query runs on top of the vector database to extract the context and then pass it along to LLM, and you get the response, which is real time indeed. So this is all of this RAG systems. There are many flavors to these systems, but then there is another version, another variant of AI that's pretty popular now, which is in the agentic space. What it means is that an agent is generally an upgraded kind of a version to RAG, wherein instead of just having a context, so it will have access to tools, right? For example, you might want to answer questions around how do I schedule when there is like X percentage of burnout expected, and how do I schedule my workforce in a way that um, there is less hiring need or something of that sort. So you see where it's going, right? So it's getting complicated within the query itself. So when you have such a use case, agents might help you there. Instead of just having a context, it can have access to tools as in any tools that can perform certain action. And even in this case, since the tools will interact with a retrieval mechanism wherein Apache Pinot is available, so you are promised to get results in real time with less latency and high concurrent queries being executed, and that's also a pretty good use case for Apache Pinot in a people analytics setting. And let's talk about people analytics, one of the use cases, right? So some of the complex use cases, whatever we've seen earlier, for example, if you're looking at employee engagement insights, you analyze the clickstream data from employee portals in real time to identify engagement patterns. By that, you would want to ask a question like which teams have seen a drop in engagement this week. So it's not it's not something like you're looking for um, the batches to process. So you have the streaming data coming in every second, and you'd want to see how teams are performing and what has been the trend about with respect to the engagement this week or this day or etc. And multiple other use cases like HR policy retrieval or candidate screening insights or attrition or prediction of the attrition. So all of those are like great candidates for such a use case, especially let's say if you are looking for candidate screening insights. So you would want to have better questions asked. So let's say you are interviewing virtually and you constantly feed the video frames to the system, which is essentially streaming images or streaming video snippets. And the system can analyze like past assessments, past interviews, and if you are trying to fulfill a position which is vacant, and if that position requires a certain level of knowledge specific to the role and specific to various other factors that you're looking for, you could build such a system to um, you know uh, extract certain questions that you might want to ask instead of just going in a generic interview process. You could ask some questions that are highly relevant, and you could make better decisions. So that's just one example. So let's dig deep into the employee engagement insights. So this use case, like standard operation, is that you build a data ingestion layer, data indexing, you do a query execution, and you integrate that with RAG, and you get the results delivered, right? So, and here you have both streaming and batch data inputs, um, and um, what happens is in some cases, like how real-time RAG with Apache can transform. Imagine being able to instantly um, identify disengaged teams or predict attrition risks based on live stream data streams, right? So something similar. Uh, if you want to understand about the employee engagements, let's say if you're in a cafe, if you're a retail outlet with a lot of cafes around, um, so you'd want to understand how people are producing the drinks and serving the customers, right? You would want to understand if everyone's following principles, I mean, certain standards, or if certain steps followed, etc., are well enough. So some of those can also be engagements, and how people interact with each other, and how people perform tasks. All of these can be some insights that you can track. Essentially, this is how the architecture looks like, as in you have Kafka and batch sources, streaming and batch sources. You pass it along by converting the data sets into vectors, embedding vectors into a Pinot cluster. Of course, all of them are StarTree indexed. And then you get the relevant data, and then you use LangChain or other LLMs that you can think of, like ChatGPT or um, uh, Claude or Llama or any of the variants that you would prefer. You can build those systems and pass it along to a user interface, so that if you are a leader and if you would want to understand like what has been the trend, um, like what was the last week's engagement per department, right? So you don't have to run the query, write the SQL code. Instead, you can just ask in plain language, natural language, and then the system does the job for you. So, and in order to make that decision, let's say instead of last 7 days, if you want to understand how is the interaction today, right? You don't have to wait for the data to be refreshed, and then expect delays because the data isn't updated to this specific moment. Uh, but with having low latency systems like Apache Pinot and indexing it properly around certain aggregations, etc., so you can have the questions answered real time. Um, that's where the difference is, right? So this is probably a simple example, but then there are multiple other cases within people analytics that you would want to build and help solve problems and answer questions that are much more nuanced, much more realistic, and much more relevant to the needs of the user. So finally, I think there are some challenges even with building such a system. So you want to ensure data being fresh. So you might want to use streaming processing via Kafka, and if you want to have like a high concurrent systems at scale, you might want to apply a horizontal scaling in Pinot clusters. Um, Often you've built the system to answer questions, but then the model or the AI algorithm might be incorrect in some situations. It might hallucinate, and there are some risks associated with using generative models too. So in those cases, you either fine tune prompts or have a better retrieval logic, or maybe switch to a different algorithm. But those are some major challenges that people see. And then some best practices is that to handle generative model risk, you have monitoring in place, you introduce guardrails, you introduce uh, uh, you know better chunking strategies, better embedding strategies, and to understand more dimensions, more information points, you might have to index better on to make sure it has like multiple dimensions being captured in the analytical tables, and being saved onto Pinot cluster. But overall, I believe so. RAG was something that has been very well talked about. But then there are other systems too, as we've spoken, like agents. But then where are we heading, right? So usually RAG always like it felt like it was a hack, a clever way to introduce context to static models, uh, in terms of fresh knowledge, etc. But now that we're pushing into models with long context and real-time awareness, it's starting to feel like RAG was just a phase. I mean, it was pretty much yesterday. Sure, there are like multiple flavors, multiple variants in RAG, but yeah, it might have worked for certain use cases. But then on the other side, you have a much more hands-on version, which is agentic AI. What happens is you give tools to the agent, to the model, to understand and make certain actions, and which sounds like a pretty much a logical next step. But what we see now is a shift from retrieval-based intelligence to context-driven real-time reasoning. So instead of fetching a document to answer a question, models are beginning to reason over streaming inputs, user history, dynamic environments, and it's less about what you know and more about what's happening right now and what happens in the moment. Yeah, I mean, dynamically, if you want to introduce dynamic intelligence, it's more about presence, being aware, adaptive, and situated in the context that changes every second. So this is where systems integrated with tools like Apache Pinot uh, outshines, right? So this sounds like the next thing that might be helpful in use cases where you have AI to answer a lot of questions. And that brings us to the conclusion. And I hope there's something that for you all to take away, and the importance of Apache Pinot and what benefits do you get uh, by implementing such tools within your applications. Um, and I hope you all have a great rest of the day. And thank you.